The trade deficit adds to your real wealth. It doesn't take away from it.
Because it's bringing real goods in while whoever's bringing them in is just getting fake numbers on a spreadsheet. Let's get into fraud number 3. Fraud 3, the federal government budget deficits take away savings. We kind of already hit this, but I guess we can hit it explicitly.
They are the savings. They just shifted the savings from a reserve account to a securities account. They're not taking anything away. And so that's why there's no crowding out. They don't drive up interest rates because the government spends first, puts $100 in your account, pays you. And then some of it gets used to pay taxes. You might spend it, but at the end of the day, whatever is left over buys a treasury security. It's not competing with anybody else for that money. If anybody else wanted to borrow, in the meantime, you could lend it to them and then they'd have it and they'd be the one buying the treasury security at the end of the day. Treasury securities are for the money that's still in these accounts at the end of the day, that's been left over, that's there because the government spent more than a tax. They paid the number higher. Credited your account for 100, debited it for 50. There's still going to be 50 there. You can only go back and forth between change hands, but at the end of the day, it's still there. And then somebody uses that to buy the security. So there's no crowding out. It doesn't drive up interest rates. It doesn't do any of that. And every mainstream model is wrong.
Yeah, that's going back to that. It just keeps cracking me up.
They've got the sequence backwards.
Yep. Well, and then speaking of backwards, it might actually be a better way to convert this from fraud to fact in another way. I could say the federal government budget surpluses take away savings.
Sure. They debit your account. You have less.
Yeah. They've taken more from the system than they put in.
Oh, and then I like the way these mainstream guys go, oh, well, we already knew that. Yeah. That's why you have all these peer-reviewed articles that are wrong. journal publications that you won Nobel Prizes for that are backwards.
Right. And that's why you call us crazy when we bring this up.
Well, also in our last conversation, we pointed out that these government budget surpluses have regularly caused major depressions throughout the history of the United States and any other country. Yeah.
Sure. But they already knew all this. Nothing new here. Otherwise, write it all down backwards. Well, it doesn't. Then they say, well, it doesn't make any difference anyway. You're going to get the same answer.
Right.
Maybe in their model, but you're going to get a totally different policy.
Thank you for bringing that up. Is that's the main point of this discussion, right? Is to say what's the policy need to be, and with the tools that you're measuring with the modern economic understanding, you're coming up with really bad policy ideas.
Well, what you've done is eliminate policy options. Because saying they're not viable when they are viable.
Right.
So the infrastructure bill, you can't pass this bill unless it's paid for. Okay, they've taken the option to increase the deficit off the table.
Right, which is a political decision, not a.
It's being done with the incomplete information, and that's the whole point. That's why it's an innocent fraud. Either they know it's a fraud and they're trying to pull something over, or it's innocent and they just don't know how it works, which is probably worse, right?
Right. I had a topic, but I think we might get completely derailed if I go on that. So let's just go on to fraud number 4. Social Security is broken.
Yeah, we've been hearing that. We're going to have to reform Social Security.
Well, and then not only are we hearing that, what my generation is told is there won't be any Social Security by the time that we get old.
Right. And they may decide not to pay when they get old.
Right, but it's not because they ran out of money.
Right. Well, the trust fund can run out of money.
Oh, this is interesting. Okay.
But the trust fund is just a ledger. It's record keeping.
Mm-hmm.
When they tax you, they debit your account and they credit the trust fund. When they spend, they credit your account. Did I say it wrong? When they tax you, they debit your account, they credit the trust fund. When they spend, give me my Social Security check, they credit my bank account and they debit the trust fund. So they tax you $3,000 for Social Security taxes. Your numbers go down, the Social Security trust fund number goes up. They give me a $3,000 Social Security check. My bank account goes up, the Social Security trust fund goes down. The trust fund now has a zero balance. It's record keeping. It is a record of what they did.
Right. And then if the trust fund went to zero,
Yeah, it's not
all they have to do is Congress says, well, make it $1 trillion, just write it back up again.
It just goes to zero. And if they then give me another check, it goes to minus 3,000. Nobody gets an electric shock, no bell rings. But it's like the debt ceiling.
Yeah.
What happens if they violate the debt ceiling?
Nothing.
They get their wrist slapped by Congress. They go to jail for violating the law. But it's not a monetary event. So there's no monetary event if the trust fund is negative. It doesn't make any difference. It's just a record of what's been done. So it's a spreadsheet that tells you what you did. So the accountants can go back and, okay, the pot's right. We spent this much and we did this, and the trust fund balance went up and down.
It's kind of like the European.
Yeah.
Like the European Union's 3% limitation. Yeah. It's an arbitrary political limit, and they tell people, "Oh, if you violate this, then you're really
bad
person.
Yeah,
we'll punish you."
Yeah, I say
we're seeing it that it doesn't really have any relevance at all, because whenever they want to, they suspend this rule. As you said, right now Italy has a 11% budget deficit.
So I call those operational constraints. They're not operational constraints. They're political constraints. The Treasury can't spend until it has to have a positive balance in its account. It's not an operational constraint. The Fed doesn't care to let the account go negative. But Congress has put that in as a matter of policy, and Congress has put in a debt ceiling. These are not operational constraints. So the government is not constrained, but the Treasury is constrained because its boss, Congress, which is the government, has said, Treasury, you're my agent, but I'm constraining you. So you got to separate when somebody says, well, the government is constrained, and they point to the Treasury. Well, that's not the government. It's an agent of Congress. Congress is the government. They constrain, like the military. Is the military constrained operationally by who they can shoot at? No. You can be walking down the street and a soldier can shoot you if he wants to. Now, operationally, he pulls the trigger, you're dead. Okay, politically, he's not allowed to do that. He can suffer severe consequences. So these are the difference, the ability to pay versus willingness to pay, operational constraints versus political constraints.
Mm-hmm.
MMT points these things out because they've gotten confused and they're limiting our policy options because the differences are all been conflated.
So fraud number 5. The trade deficit is an unsustainable imbalance that takes away jobs and output.
Yeah. Well, but the political response to the trade balance takes away jobs. But in any base case for analysis, the trade benefit's a benefit. Now, based on institutional structure and policy and what we do, it can be a real detriment because of we have Congress and because of that, the reason it's a deadly innocent fraud. We had Trump imposing the tariffs, which is a point when the economy at that point in time started to slow. The tax cuts had sustained the economy, nothing great, it was okay. And they're pretty well multiple. But then as soon as the tariffs kicked in, everything rolls over and starts going accelerating. Then COVID hits, it goes down some more. COVID starts to alleviate a little bit. People going back to work. Biden doubles down on the tariffs, and we're still getting hurt by these. Now we have all these prices going up, which are hurting people's ability to consume. They're going up faster than wages. Tariffs, the supply disruptions the tariffs are not independent from the supply shocks. A lot of it's COVID, but tariffs are contributing. They all think it's got 95 or 100% political approval that we've got to do something about China, and the trade balance. And they've got it 180 degrees backwards. It's another thing that they've got backwards, and that's why it's a deadly innocent fraud. The trade deficit adds to your real wealth. It doesn't take away from it.
Because it's bringing real goods in while whoever's bringing them in is just getting fake numbers on a spreadsheet. I mean, not fake, but I mean, they're mad,
You're getting tax credits. So, it's fine if they want tax credits. So,
but on the flip side of that, I do want to bring this up because I've heard you mention this before. And again, this goes back to it's a political decision because steel was one of the big things that Trump was talking about. And he felt that, and I agree with this, is that a country should be able to make its own steel as a matter of national security, not as a matter of economics.
No, those are called strategic considerations.
Right. Where you're going, we don't want to be at the behest of a foreigner to say, okay, you know what? No more steel, no more oil.
Right.
Yeah.
And so what you do is you can have strategic things, but you don't pretend that makes you wealthier or makes you better off.
Yes.
It's like building a military doesn't make anybody richer. You just all these resources go into building military equipment, but without it, you're going to be a lot worse off. So there's certain things you do, like buying insurance that has a real cost that you don't benefit by. Okay. And if you buy life insurance and you don't die, you don't get matched because there's a risk reward in it.
Right.
Okay. So, but you have to understand what your real wealth is. So there's the fundamentals. So your real wealth is a pile of stuff. So everything you produce domestically is your pile of stuff that's yours as a nation to consume. Okay, all the goods and services. And the more people you have working, the more goods and services you have, so you're wealthier as a nation. So that's the imperative of full employment, to maximize, optimize, in addition to it, but full employment maximizes your output, your domestic output. So that's your wealth. Okay? In addition to that, anything you import makes your pile bigger. And anything you export makes your pile smaller. The difference between imports and exports is called your real terms of trade. This is in all the old textbooks. You want to optimize your real terms of trade. You want to get the most for what you export. That's why you're doing it. Why else would you send something out except to bring something in?
Mm-hmm.
And you feel the exchange is worthwhile. Okay, that's why you do it. So keeping full employment is something we should always do in any case with what I call full employment policy, which means fiscal balance. It means making sure unemployed who are there because their tax was too high for the spending you did have a avenue to transition back into the private sectors to maintain full employment all the time. And with the right fiscal policies and what we call the job guarantee, you can maintain, maybe the equivalent of 2% unemployment rate, 1%, which will optimize your real output domestically, no matter what your trade is.
Right.
Yes, your budget deficit might go up and down, but that's just accounting for what you did to optimize your full employment, which is your real wealth.
Right. So, and then, looking at this fraud here. So the trade deficit, I want to be sure that I have this right. Yeah. Trade deficit means we're sending out too much money in order to bring this stuff in, and that's negatively affecting the economy because we're losing jobs because all that stuff's going overseas. Whereas you're saying, well, sure, but you could, we can still employ everybody because that's just a political choice.
Right. And look, recently what's happened is our trade deficit's gone way up, record deficit with China recently. And the government has been handing out stimulus checks and tax breaks and everything else, increased the deficit by $5 trillion. And that sustained everybody's purchasing power. So nobody was hurt. Nobody lost any jobs because we had enough money through fiscal policy to be able to employ ourselves, everybody who wanted to, doing something else. We've had one of the fastest recoveries on record, which is now kind of stalling out. But because of the opposite reason, because the deficit suddenly is collapsing. But while the government was taking proper measures to offset the lack of demand, I'll call it that, because of the trade deficit, lower taxes or higher public services, transfer payments, which is a kind of a lower tax, giving you back your tax. Excuse me. Then, we sustained it. We're fine. We had our largest trade deficit, real term deficit in 1999. We had a massive trade deficit of like $400 billion, and we had strong GDP growth. It was one of the best years. And we had low unemployment and low inflation, both 3.5% unemployment, 2% inflation. With a massive trade deficit. Well, at the time, the deficit spending was being done by the private sector. The private sector was spending more than 7% of GDP. The government was actually running a surplus, which at the time was appropriate because, you need enough private sector deficit spending to offset unspending income, or public sector. You need enough total deficit spending, private income. And the private sector was going gangbusters with private sector debt to the moon, right? Highest ever on record by a long shot.
Well, and that was kind of setting the grounds for 2008, right?
2001, 2000. Because it was Y2K and it was the .com boom, all the equity. That's all private sector debt that was buying all that stuff, and housing boom, all the mortgages and everything else. So it was good, relatively good economic. And it was all fueled by private sector debt. When the private sector debt collapsed in 2000, that was the government's opportunity to now cut taxes and increase public services to sustain demand. But it didn't do that for a long time until the Bush tax cuts and spending increases, prescription drugs for Medicare. Did I ever tell you that story?
Maybe. Tell us again.
Okay, so in 2002, I think, the year before the election, no, 2003, 2004 election, my wife and I get invited to the White House to go meet Andrew Carter, who was chief of staff, because the economy wasn't doing well. Interest rates were down to 1%. It wasn't working. They were worried about the election coming up. George Bush, first Bush, second Bush, he was president. And I wasn't a supporter of his policies, but it was the president. And I had a car company at the time. And on my board of directors was Dave McClellan, the General Motors engineer, and Joe Zymek, the Ford engineer. And Dave was head of Corvette for 17 years. They went on top of it. He knew Andrew Carter because he'd been a GM executive with him, and said, "Hey, you got to go talk to Andy about this." And I said, "Okay." So we go to the West Wing and walked in. None of the photographers took our picture. We sit in a waiting room. He was about 15 minutes late. There's a bowl of these little Snicker bars. Elizabeth's taking the Snickers and put them in her pocket for souvenirs. Mm-hmm. And anyway, Andrew Carter calls us in, and a super sharp guy. And the first thing I go through is the interest rates, why they got that backwards, and why the 1% is making it worse and not better, because all those payments stopped, caused a fiscal contraction.
Mm-hmm.
He goes, yeah, why would anybody think rates are going to help? Then I explained how what you need is deficit spending, lower taxes, higher spending. And he looks at it. Again, he's a systems engineer. The guy knows this stuff. He goes, yeah, of course. He said, well, how large does it have to be? And I said, well, I think back then it was like 700 billion, which was a lot.
Right.
And he says, we don't have much time, do we? I said, no. He says, okay, thank you very much. We got to get going on this. And we leave. And I get a nice thank you note from him and all that. A week later, President Bush is asked about the deficit. And he goes, look, I don't care about numbers on a piece of paper. I care about jobs. So you know where that statement came from, right? President Carter. And then this was maybe March or April, and he cut every tax he could. He had retroactive tax cuts. I don't know if you remember that. I don't know if you're older. He did every taxes from last year cut and get money back. Mm-hmm. He spent everything he could. The reason they have prescription drugs covered in Medicare is because they needed to spend the money to get the deficit up. Okay, and the deficit got up to $200 billion in the third quarter, which was about my $700 billion figure. The economy started turning around, and it didn't cost him the election. I won't say I won the election, but it would have cost him the election. It certainly was good enough where it didn't cost him the election. He did get reelected. So again, I wasn't big on his politics and all that. You're always torn as an American whether you want to promote somebody, president you don't disagree with for the good of the country. But,
right.
He was the elected official, and I decided to do it. And so that kind of answers your question there about something. I've forgotten your questions, but so on.
I think I got a $600 stimulus check back then, or something.
Yeah. Okay. So you remember that? Yeah.
I think I was too young.
Yeah, it was a retroactive tax cut.
I wasn't even paying taxes at that point.
Yeah.
But in terms of what we were talking about, I forgot too. But I did want to point out is that so when the guy said to you, "We don't have much time, do we?" He was recognizing the fact that there wasn't like that because the private sector had popped essentially.
Yeah,
it was a time crunch before we got to get the spending out before the whole thing flops in on itself, which happened, right? Yeah. So they did this initial push for $200 billion. You thought the number was $700 billion.
It was a lot more than that. That was just for the quarter.
So
that was the third quarter. It was like a $700 billion annual rate.
So why did the crash still happen then? if
it's in. This was after the crash. It started recovering after that. That was the beginning of the recovery.
Wait, I thought we were talking about 2004.
2001.
But I mean, the effects of the crash, were really felt in 2008, right?
2008 was something else. By 2006, the growth had taken the deficit down to 1% of GDP. And I had in my blog, this is too small. It's not enough to support the credit structure. The mortgage housing market was already, coming down because of the lack of deficit spending. And by 2008, first of all, OPEC Saudis decided to raise oil prices up to $155 a barrel, which drained the millions, shifted money from people spending it to people who don't spend it. And, so the net savings increased. That aspect of the trade deficit went. And the government didn't recognize it. We left everything. We had $170 billion stimulus or something in 2007 that actually resulted in 2.5% growth rate. And my partner Kareem says, this is looking really bad for the rest of the year. This is first quarter. I said, well, let's just do another one. How hard is it? They just did it. But they did. They just let it all happen. It's like a slow motion train wreck. We didn't have another stimulus till like 2009 in the first quarter.
Right, after everyone had lost their houses and their jobs and all that sort of.
Yeah. They just wouldn't do it. So anyway, that crash was separate from the recovery.
That never occurred to me that those were two separate.
Yeah.
2001, 2008 were two separate
2001 crash was bad. Really bad. That's when the NASDAQ went from 5,000 to 1,500. I mean, the markets dropped 70%, and unemployment was way up. Everything else.
I was 15. I wasn't paying attention.
What also happened, I think, towards 2006, 2005, 2006, throughout the whole period, is that the U.S. Current account deficit went up quite noticeably, I think, compared to previous decades. And the budget deficit wasn't sufficient to offset the drain of net private savings from the private sector to the foreign sector, if I understand that correctly.
Well, yeah, and there wasn't enough private sector debt either. So when you have unspent income, in this case, the foreign sector is no different than somebody in North Carolina, Texas with an oil well who sells oil and doesn't spend the money. So it's a question of whether you have unspent income or not. So when you have unspent income from any one person, any one agent, then you've got to have somebody else spending more than their income by that amount, or else the output doesn't get sold. Think if everybody decided not to spend anything, GDP goes to zero.
Right.
Okay, so if everybody spends nothing, somebody has to spend all the 28 trillion or whatever GDP is this year, or else it goes to zero. And that person's spending more than their income. People with the income don't spend it. Somebody else has to. It could be private sector or public or non-resident or resident. Foreign sector is just people who don't live here, they live somewhere else. But for dollar purposes, it doesn't really matter that much.
Everyone, please like, comment, and subscribe to help us grow this channel. I think we cover a lot of good stuff. We're covering ideas that you're not hearing anywhere else. Economic ideas, historical ideas, systematic politics ideas you're not hearing anywhere else.